Good morning and welcome to Environment Journal's EnviroExchange series. My name is Corinne Lynds and I'm the content director here at Actual Media. I'll be your moderator for today's discussion on the decarbonization of Canada. By now, you've probably noticed everyone checking in along the right-hand side with the chat feature. Please say hello, let us know who you are and where you're from. Right above the chat, you'll see an Actual Media icon. If you click follow, you'll continue to be updated on our EnviroExchange series as new webinars are announced. And down below, you'll see a variety of information. You can see how many people are signed into today's webinar. You'll see the polls feature where we encourage you to cast your votes. And you'll also see a little green button with rotating links to the speakers' websites. So please be sure to check those out as well. And most importantly is the Ask a Question feature. So don't be shy about becoming part of the conversation. I'll do my best to pose your questions to our panelists throughout the discussion. Today's session marks the first in a brand new series of EnviroExchange webinars that Environmental Journal will be hosting throughout 2022. We have an impressive lineup of speakers joining us for this important discussion. But before I jump in and introduce them, I would like to take a few moments to acknowledge the First Nations and Indigenous peoples of Canada as the original stewards of this great country. I'm here in Toronto, which is located on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. We all share in the responsibility of our natural infrastructure, and there's much we can learn from the traditional knowledge of the land, water, and materials that allow us to build projects that benefit all Canadians. All right, let's jump in and meet our experts. I'm going to begin by inviting each of our panelists to the screen. Once they're all on screen, I'll have them spend just a moment to introduce themselves and quickly tell us a little bit about where they're from, what their role is, and what perspective they're bringing to today's discussion. First up, we have Katie Sullivan from the International Trading Emissions Association. Welcome, Katie.
Thank you, Connie.
And then we have Rick Smith is up next. Hello, Rick.
Hi there. Good to be here.
We have Mel De Jager from WSP Canada.
Hi, everyone.
Good morning. And then last up, joining us soon is Tej Gidda from GHD. There he is.
Hi, everyone. Good morning.
Welcome. All right, so I'm going to invite each of you to introduce yourselves. Now, Katie, will you kick us off, please?
Of course. Thank you, Connie, and the EnviroExchange organizers for the invite in the great event. I think it's a really timely event. I come at you from the International Emissions Trading Association, typically based in Toronto, but I'm in Ottawa these days. IETA, for those of you who are not familiar, it's the trusted global business voice on market solutions to tackle climate change. We came out of the UN process over 20 years ago, and our mission is really to advance the goals of the Paris Agreement and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. We work all over the world across sectors and borders to create the markets that drive decarbonization and unlock private capital at scale. Our members, we over the last year have grown quite significantly, which might not be a surprise, but we have around 200 members all around the world, again, across different sectors, and many of those include those with assets, exposure, investments, and workforces across Canada. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion and unpacking some of these important issues related to the global context on net zero, and then digging into Canada and the opportunities ahead. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Katie. All right, Rick, you're up next.
Well, hi everyone, and it's great to be here. Thanks so much to the organizers. I think this is going to arguably be the most important year in Canadian history when it comes to carbon reduction, moving climate change progress forward. So I think this event is well timed. I'm fortunate enough to be the president of the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. We're the national climate change policy research organization. We're active right across the country, and we try to dig down in 3 different areas of climate policy. So we have a hardworking research team that looks at the best ways to reduce carbon. We have a team that looks at adaptation. We've been very busy lately responding to the flooding in British Columbia, wildfires in the West. It's clear that these sorts of extreme weather phenomena are going to become more frequent in the future. And our third team looks at clean growth. So the economic argument, how are we going to make sure as patriotic Canadians that our country prospers in this new economic reality with this accelerating low carbon transition that's happening globally. So we're going to have a busy year. We have an upcoming major report on electrification, mostly looking at the supply side. If we start to plug in our vehicles, if we start to electrify everything, what does that mean in terms of the necessary build out of new infrastructure? So we'll be rolling out a series of significant reports over the next few months, including focusing on the federal government's upcoming emission reduction plan that's due in March.
Great, thank you, Rick. All right, Mel, go ahead.
Thanks very much, Corinne, and thanks also for having me here. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So it's nice to meet you all. I'm Mel. I'm the Vice President for Climate Change, Resilience and Sustainability with WSP Canada. WSP is a global advisory and engineering consulting firm with a significant presence here in Canada. My role is essentially twofold. I lead a national team of climate change and sustainability advisors and consultants that work across a wide variety of sectors, primarily delivering expertise and services for climate risk and opportunity, decarbonization, ESG, and sustainability strategy more broadly. And we do that across the financial services sector, infrastructure, real estate, industry, and government, of course, just to name a few. Additionally, as the market sector lead for ESG and climate change more broadly within the organization, I also work to drive strategy for climate change and ESG throughout the wider organization, both locally as well as globally, and connect more often these days with my global counterparts as we start taking on more global mandates, which are starting to become a lot more common. So thanks very much for having me, and looking forward to it.
Thank you. All right, well, let's jump in. So just as a bit of background, the Government of Canada is underway with an accelerated plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through strengthened climate action initiatives.
Sorry, Corinne, I may as well jump in. Do you want me to introduce myself as well?
Oh my God, Tej, did I do this to you before?
You did.
Why am I,
I don't know. I'm not taking it personally, though.
I think Tej should introduce himself at length and give us a life story. I'm so sorry.
I won't do that to you. I won't do that to the audience either. So I'm, good morning, everyone. I'm Tej Gidda. I work at a company called GHD, which is a global engineering company. And I am GHD's global leader for what we call future energy. And that's a very consolidated approach to decarbonization around the world. So we set this initiative up a couple of years ago. It's a really large pillar of what we want to do in the client space around the world. So I'm an engineer, and we're a lot of engineers. So we're more on the implementation side of really taking strategy to an implementable level and actually developing assets. So we've been doing that in the spaces of carbon capture and hydrogen, renewable natural gas, conventional renewables at large scale, offshore wind around the world. And we're really, really interested in helping a number of our clients in the oil and gas space, the equity wealth spaces, governmental organizations, municipalities really get on top of what it's going to take to actually decarbonize as part of what I call a just transition, because I think that's very important as well. I also have 4 kids. It's really important for me personally to leave them a better world. That's a big part of what sort of fuels my fire in this space. So very pleased to be chatting with a great panel this morning.
Thank you so much. And again, I'm so sorry. All right, so I'm going to try and jump in again, see how I go. So the Government of Canada is underway with an accelerated plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through strengthened climate action initiatives and additional measures to achieve net zero by 2050. Some of these new measures include things like capping and cutting oil and gas sector emissions, further reducing methane emissions, mandating the sale of zero emissions vehicles, eliminating fossil fuel subsidies, and ultimately putting us on a path to achieve an electricity grid with net zero emissions. So as industry leaders, we need to prepare our path forward or risk falling behind global markets. So today, this fantastic panel we've got lined up is going to focus on the latest environmental policies and economic incentives and provide their perspectives on what we can expect in 2022. Katie, I am going to look to you to start us off. I'd love it if you could start off by telling us a little bit. You were able to participate in UN Climate Change Conference, COP26. There were certainly many environmental wins being reported there, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention a couple. So the approval of Article 6 on international emissions trading, Canada's commitment to phase out fossil fuel emissions 2 years earlier than G20 partners, and the new cap on the oil and gas sector, to name just a few. But I know there was also some criticism of what was left on the table. Were you satisfied with the outcomes? Can you give us a little bit of perspective?
Hey, thanks, Connie. Glad we brought in Tej there. No, this is great. It's a good question. I think actually I'll start. I mean, for Canada, so I was at COP, and I know Rick was at COP as well. This was my, I think, 11th or 12th COP. So becoming a veteran in the COP circles and have some benchmarks around what is or is not considered a successful COP. But I think specifically to Canada, the country through COP, right, it did step up with confidence and tons of diplomacy, including on the climate finance journey. Through the whole year leading into Glasgow, we had the updated nationally determined contribution, and it's not a weak target. It is quite ambitious. It's actually more ambitious compared to a number of other countries. So at least for Canada, NDC, meeting it is going to take heroic effort. Lots and lots of investment and international cooperation, which touches on a bit of the Article 6 win that we saw. But again, specific to Canada, you had just all this whole flurry of announcements as well, beyond those that you just mentioned, including on finance and nature-based solutions and methane and a number of other things. But now is delivery time, not just for Canada, for many, many other countries. So proof's going to be in the pudding. Really, and it is game on for the emission reduction plan that we'll see tabled by the end of March. I know Rick will probably get into a bit more of the details and expectations, but we will see likely an interim 2026 target as part of that package and some measures and some pathways, but there's still a lot of uncertainty about what that plan will include, and I think some of the tougher sledding will be on this oil and gas cap and the sector cap, and including how that interacts with other policies and measures, including the existing and post-2022 carbon pricing landscape that we see in Canada. So on the COP front internationally, and I think that many do consider Glasgow a success, and I'd be a part of that camp. Keep in mind that the conditions for success definitely didn't exist. There was tons of anxiety, right, and logistical nightmares heading into Glasgow with the pandemic. There were major geopolitical tensions. Xi and Putin decided not to join the Climate Leaders Summit, although you also then saw massive pressure, public pressure, growing pressure and scrutiny that was welcome with civil society and youth. US was back at the table, played a big role. And you had major corporate and investor commitments that were made. So lots of good tailwinds going into it. I think at the highest level in Glasgow, it's going to be remembered for its efforts to enhance that ambition. It drove progress on these nationally determined contributions that were updated. We now see over 150 countries that have put forward these updated targets, and we're expecting more in 2022 as we head to Sharm el-Sheikh. Also, you saw the increased long-term ambition and net zero strategies. And so that whole keeping 1.5 degree alive is very much a thing, although in the words of Alok Sharma, on life support, right? And you also actually, the unprecedented level of bilateral and multilateral pledges and initiatives that were announced was a big deal. And it wasn't just by governments. Again, across all these different topics on the methane and the deforestation and CCUS and finance, but also the corporates and the investors, right? That we hadn't seen in the past to that level. But I think it's important when you look at, say, the Glasgow Financial Alliance on net zero, where they say, hey, there's $130 trillion, in assets, 450 financials managing that, that they're ready. But it's going to take some really clear rules and mechanisms to actually deploy that. So it's a lot of work ahead of us. And then finally, last but certainly not least, the outstanding elements of the Paris rulebook. And I'll end it on this because this is really important. There are some outstanding issues to the Paris rulebook to actually operationalize the Paris Agreement. And there had been a lot of stickier complex negotiations. We didn't land it in Katowice, we didn't land it in Madrid, and then we finally got those core elements. And it includes detailed reporting requirements for parties to report on their NDCs and the progress, common timeframes for NDCs. So now we have these 5-year ambition cycles. And then we had what we hear hold near and dear to our hearts, certainly at AID and the business community, finally a rule book for Article 6. And this means that we finally have an integrity framework and some guidance for countries to be able to cooperate using carbon markets, international carbon markets, to help reach their NDCs or enhance that level of climate ambition going forward. I'll hand it back to you, Connie.
Thank you. All right then. Okay, Rick. So the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices has identified 9 ways to take federal action on climate change to the next level, drawing on its recent research and analysis in 4 priority areas: making Canada more resilient, cutting carbon emissions, driving clean growth, and mobilizing investment in climate solutions. Can you tell us a bit more about this research? I think you talked a little bit about it in your opening.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And just picking up on some of Katie's comments, I also agree that Glasgow was a success. And one reason, she gave one big reason, which is that private capital is now fully engaged in the climate debate. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that those massive COPs, or that the climate discussion in general was really a discussion amongst environment ministers and sort of geeky climate researchers, and every once in a while it would sort of erupt into the media. But what we now see in the lead up to Glasgow, after Glasgow, is a far broader, deeper realization, discussion that this carbon transition is not a blip. This is the new reality, the new accelerating reality for the global economy, and countries like Canada need to either get on board or get sideswiped by these massive global trends. So I'm really optimistic about what we're going to see in our country in 2022 in terms of tangible progress across a range of climate policies. And our organization is going to be trying to execute our mission of making sure this discussion is rooted in the best available science, research, economic modeling. And we're going to do that right throughout the year. I'll just highlight, I'm not going to run down all 9 of the things on our to-do list. I mean, people, please check out our website, climatechoices.ca. But let me highlight 3 moments this year where I think significant progress will be had. The first is the release of the federal government's of this country's first 2030 emissions reduction plan. So as your viewers no doubt know, we finally have a new national climate change law. Net zero is the law of the land as of last July. The first big deliverable for the federal government is this emission reduction plan, which is going to be the first ever kind of framework for progress that we've had in this country. Yes, we've had sort of one-off federal announcements about singular policies. Yes, we've had some provincial governments moving forward, but the significance of this upcoming moment in March is we're going to see the full meal deal across industrial sectors, some benchmarks for private capital. What is the architecture of this plan for the country? And what I hope to see is that Canada moves towards what the UK has long done, which is kind of an annual cycle of planning, assessing progress against the plan, tweaking the plan, and then repeating. So this March, we're going to be looking at this emission reduction plan and trying to make sure that whether it's the electric vehicle mandate, whether it's methane regulations, whether it's some of these other tangible things that the federal government's going to knit together into one plan, we're going to aim our research at that. The second significant moment is the release of the National Adaptation Strategy in the fall. So again, I'm sure people have seen the outcome of the flooding, the wildfires in British Columbia. There's now a joint ministerial task force coming out of that to learn some lessons for the country. Clearly, these extreme weather phenomena are accelerating, not just in Canada, but around the world. These things are turbocharging the climate discussion like never before. We did some polling last year. Canadians, the attitude of Canadians towards climate change is really changing. So, what was a kind of notional, longer-term concern around climate change is turning into a much more proximate concern for the health and well-being of their families, their communities. So this national adaptation strategy in terms of updating flood mapping, updating the way we think about infrastructure resilience, that's going to be a key moment this fall as well. Very quickly, a third thing that we're looking at, that we're trying to aim our research and modeling at, is nailing down for Canada climate change risk disclosure, for starters, for publicly traded companies. And I think we're going to start to see this creeping into private markets as well. So obviously, again, this carbon transition is accelerating globally. Companies demonstrating tangible, measurable net zero commitments, aligning their investments with net zero is going to become an imperative in terms of competing successfully. And so Canada needs to get a move on requiring our markets to measure up to emerging best practices globally.
Thank you. I see there's some questions coming in. What I'm going to do is we just got a couple more questions for our panelists here, and then we're going to take a bit of a question from the audience break, if you will. So I'm going to switch focus over to you, Mel, now. And the federal plan is supported by an initial $15 billion investments. Most recently, $200 million in funds was launched as part of the Low Carbon Economy Fund's Champion Stream. How are you helping your clients plan for the climate realities ahead, and how are you helping them to leverage public and private investment opportunities?
Sure. Thanks, Corinne. I think I would just start the conversation by saying and adding on to the comments so far that there has significantly been a shift in the availability of funding and capital in the last year or 2 years at a speed that I don't think many of us anticipated. And I think on the back end of Glasgow, for sure, with the Glasgow Financial Alliance, there's been a significant shift there. And so, it's great to see our government announcing a new, 200 million here, and those numbers are getting bigger and they're getting more often, which is fantastic to see. But there certainly has been a significant shift in the availability of funding and private capital, which is fantastic to see. To Katie's point, it's sort of game on, and the train is running now, and everybody from our perspective is invested and is on that track. And I think the second thing to that point too, which has been a fundamental shift, and we can certainly see it in our clients, is that over years gone by, I would say that the conversation around climate change and sustainability has somewhat been peripheral to the projects, to the strategies, to the organizations. And now we're seeing that it is much more a core driver and a focal area of the projects themselves, of the strategies themselves. Now, we work with a lot of clients across a lot of spectrums, and I think the drivers vary. In some cases, it is as a result of regulation and law from our own government. But more often than not, it's coming from institutional investors who are now starting to put the pressure on companies. The boards are now driving certain things. We still have a significant amount of companies who were ahead of the curve, because they wanted to do the right thing, essentially. But now there's been a significant shift, I would say, across the spectrum. Irrespective of the drivers, the conversation is there and people are asking a lot of questions. We work with a lot of clients as a result of that through very different stages of their climate change and sustainability journey. And in many cases, for those who started ages ago, we're fortunate enough to be supporting them in some very detailed analysis and strategy development to help them decarbonize and assess their climate risk. We are doing quite a lot of work right now for the federal government in understanding the risk and the emissions associated with their portfolios across the country, and helping them to plot decarbonization pathways to reduce those as a result of us having a carbon target federally for a couple of years now. And what's really fantastic to see on the outcome of that work as well is the results of it actually informing capital decision-making and financial decision-making. Versus before, it might have just been, a little bit more theoretical and here's what we could possibly do, but it really is making its way into decision-making. I think the other thing too, we were helping our clients, again, on the earlier side of the journey, is it's less now a question of it's the right thing to do, and much more an understanding that it is fundamental to risk management, enterprise risk management, and enterprise value creation. And I think that a lot of our clients are very interested, irrespective of their drivers, in understanding and assessing what's going on and then identifying the opportunities. And the conversation is also shifting quite quickly from what is the risk to what is the opportunity. And so we work with a lot of our clients across those industries to help them assess what is your status quo, what is your risk, what is your GHG emissions baseline, and then work with them to identify what are the pathways for you, what are the next steps, how do we de-risk, how do you decarbonize. There's no one size fits all. Every organization is going to be different and drivers are different. And so we work to help support them in the best way that they can. I think one of the fundamental things that we are focusing on trying to do at the same time is, as we go through these processes with our clients, is to use those opportunities to build capacity and knowledge within these organizations. I think there is a significant shift happening here, and there are not enough people, honestly, to be doing this work. And so we very intentionally and pride ourselves on helping to build the understanding and the capacity for this work throughout the industry, because it is certainly going to be needed as a big lift. As we say, it is now game on and going full tilt. And so, we're helping to build that capacity as well within these organizations to do this.
Thank you. All right, Tej, now with your work in carbon emissions reductions and your role as professor of environmental engineering at the University of Waterloo, are you involved in funding applications and development of new approaches for energy production? And what can you tell us about the state of the environmental engineering industry in terms of the race to net zero? Do you see your clients and students making enough progress, or are they running into obstacles? And if so, what are they? I know that's a whole lot of question, but I'd love to get your perspective.
Yeah, no problem. So I don't want to overstate my role as a professor. I'm an adjunct professor at the University of Waterloo, so very much a part-time role. I have a full-time job in addition to that, I guess because I have a lot of time on my hands. So the first part, the state of the environmental engineering industry. So we have a lot of talent in Canada in the engineering industry. I'm an environmental engineer by trade as well. We have a lot of talent here. I think one of the really important parts of this discussion is repurposing that to what needs to be done now. And I think Mel sort of said it. There's an incredible shift in capital, for instance, that's out there, and we're feeling that all the time. And actually, one of the rate limiting steps that we're seeing now is where's all that money going, and where are all these projects to place that money? There is more money out there than there are projects right now. So from an environmental engineering standpoint, it's reconceptualizing the discussion. How do we create these opportunities for that money to be placed in a reasonable way? Usually we end up being at end of pipe. Someone comes to us with a proposition, can you engineer something? And we go to work. I think we need to be more creative than that in the engineering sector. We need to be finding the opportunities. We need to be leveraging the knowledge that we already have to discover where they are. How do we repurpose a pipeline network? What does that pipeline now carry compared to what it used to carry, which might have been a gaseous or a liquid fossil fuel? What are these things, and where are the renewables that can interface with that pipeline network? Can we carry energy not in poles and wires, but through pipeline, and vice versa? I think there are a lot of questions around that, and I think the electrical network is a vast supplier of energy to us, but there's also lots of liquid and gaseous fuels that we consume on a regular basis. It's a much harder to abate sector. So how do we as environmental engineers participate in that discussion? There are some solutions there. They're challenging, but I think we have to be really, really creative about that. And I think that's something we really put our minds to. You mentioned net zero, Corinne. I think, not being as versed in exactly sort of, how do you set a net zero goal? I'm always concerned about net zero too. In my mind, I think we should be pushing towards a net negative future. I think net zero gets us to some sort of steady state over time. But what's sort of beyond that? And I think we need to be creative about what that solution is from an engineering standpoint as well. In terms of clients, I think Mel kind of said this as well. There are companies ahead of the curve. I think you said, Mel, and I agree with that. It's amazing how many companies are out there that are really pushing hard in the space, but it's not everyone. There are some early movers and early adopters that are pushing pretty hard and doing some spectacular work. There are municipalities doing that. I work a lot with the City of Toronto. City of Toronto has an incredible agenda for using its own assets to reduce emissions. And, to me, it's very, very groundbreaking. So I think lining up and just telling the stories of people who are adopting early and moving on really great projects helps to build a platform by which we can share experiences with other people. I think that's really important. I think the final part of your question was around the student landscape. So young people coming out of school, and I love being in the classroom setting when I can. An incredible amount of enthusiasm for young professionals for doing something about this issue and making sure we can actually achieve that 1.5 degree planet. There's a lot of will there. I would love to see university curriculums have a little bit more about sustainability and what this actually looks like and what this looks like as they come out, and to prioritize it a bit more. The will is certainly there amongst the young people coming out. I think we need to give a bit more training and a bit more prioritization in the curriculum to make sure they're fully equipped for when they come out.
Fantastic. All right, we have a lineup of questions for me. You guys have clearly inspired everyone's thought processes. So I'm going to hop in and start out with this one. What does net zero mean for Canada, given that the Science Based Target Initiative released a standard on net zero emissions? How do they define reduction, and are they aligning with SBTI requirements? Anyone want to jump in on that one? Or is everyone avoid?
I think I can start, and maybe Rick, I'll hand it over to you then as well, because you're talking about what's coming up in March. I think the current net zero target as set by the federal government, I would say, is not SBTI aligned, because it was set a long time before SBTI even came to fruition. I would say that the hope is that it will be aligned in the future. And so, Rick, I'm going to hand over to you to see if you can shed some light on what's coming up in March and how connected that will be.
Well, look, I mean, I think you've hit the nail on the head, which is that we're only just reaching the point in our country where we're moving from a dispute about whether we should do much at all to a moment where we're actually going to have a plan that we can start to iterate. And again, what the best practice, one of the best practices to look to in this regard is the UK, where there's the Climate Change Act was passed in 2008. Our counterpart, the UK Climate Change Committee, every year takes a look at the plan, assesses the nation's progress against the plan. The plan is tweaked, targets are tweaked, and then they repeat that year over year. And of course, the UK has had a 50% reduction in GHG emissions since 1990. So clearly something's working there that we can learn from. So in March, what we're going to see from the federal government is a heavy lift. It's the first iteration of our national plan. The federal minister has identified 5 priority areas for consultation, ranging from for inclusion in the plan, ranging from a new electric vehicle mandate, some things that are already moving forward that have been fleshed out already, like methane regulations, and then some new policy proposals like a cap and cut on oil and gas sector emissions. So I think what we're going to see in March is kind of a mixture of further detail on policies that have already been announced, added to new policy proposals, and one of the significant aspects of that March moment is going to be, for the first time, we're going to see that the whole table set in terms of carbon reduction policies, and we'll start to see how these things interact with each other and which sectors are going to be contributing what. Our Net Zero Act actually is quite a specific to-do list that the federal government needs to follow.
All right, thank you. All right, go ahead, Katie.
Sorry, I have to get used to the toggle volume, the mute. I didn't press it in time earlier, but I'm glad that Mel highlighted when we talk about SBTI. I mean, we're talking about the voluntary and these corporate targets and commitments, and so what we're also seeing, and I'm kind of touching on some of the questions in the chat box. There's some great ones coming in, but really, now compared to before, when you look at Canada, or just broadly, this whole world around investors awakening and corporates taking it seriously and then pursuing these net zero targets. And that it's a game changer. And I will say, there's a ton of capital out there. I think as Tej mentioned, there's a shortage of actual projects. Where is this private capital going to go? Capital is mobile. Private capital is mobile, so now that is trying to seek destinations. And I think part of the discussion today is about how Canada is and continue to be a destination for this private capital. But in the world of SBTI, and there's a ton of consultations still ongoing with SBTI in the corporates, right? We had the corporate standard last year launched around Glasgow. There's one now for investors around SBTI. There's one happening right now around land use as well, and baking that into considerations around these corporate net zero targets. And so I also think that the world of the voluntary space, it's not and broadly voluntary targets, but then specifically to voluntary markets, carbon markets, which we are seeing surge. It's also a matter of this compliance space, which comes to Rick's point about Canada and how we're seeing more and more compliance programs, targets, and companies in the past have really been driven by, compliance or pre-compliance plays, right? Well, now it's much broader than that. It's there is the compliance, pre-compliance, what's coming down the pipeline on this, and how can we be prepared to comply and remain competitive. But it's also broader than that, in a matter of having to actually retain social license to operate and corporate reputation. And now there's consumers and other stakeholders that are putting big pressure on for these companies to remain in business, frankly. So just I wanted to make it clear with the SBTI space, very important, keep an eye on that. But also this is very much the voluntary corporate world of SBTI versus compliance and what we're seeing in that framework in Canada and other countries.
I have a question here that actually kind of rolls into one of the ones that I wanted to ask about in terms of skills shortages and development as well. There's a question here about what can a civil engineer or recent civil engineer graduate do to be part of the climate change movement in Canada? I think that's a great question.
Well, maybe I'll take a first stab at that, Corinne. So I think, there is a shortage of people to do work in this area out there, or at least there's an apparent shortage is maybe the way I would say it. I think there's a lot of job openings out there for engineers, civil engineers, environmental engineers to get into this space. At the same time as that, I think there is a lot of talent that can be repurposed in this country. We have a lot of people who've been deeply involved in the oil and gas space and have incredible skills around things like handling hydrogen. We handle a lot of hydrogen in the oil and gas space. In Canada already, we produce a lot of hydrogen. There are skill sets where people know how to utilize this product. There will be a hydrogen economy developing. And again, it's probably going to be tightly related to the pipeline infrastructure that we already have. That's already moving, I think. Having people who are familiar with how to handle that product safely coming into that sector, and as it relates to the overlap with renewables, because there is one, I think is really important. But I think there's such a need for young people to come into that sector deliberately. And I think that deliberate show of interest in this space is really important. For me, if as an employer, if people come to me and say, look, I really am interested in this, and it's a genuine, authentic interest in that space, I don't think there's any shortage of potential opportunities for people who are looking at that. I think it's just a case of expressing that very openly. There's an incredible amount of opportunity, and it's just going to keep increasing.
Maybe I'll just add to what Tej was saying. I think there's obviously that direct avenue, and there's also the switch of existing expertise that we have. And I would say then there's sort of, for me, there's another third avenue, which is just the addition of some climate expertise and component to people's core areas of expertise. Right? I think we've got an enormous amount of engineers, of scientists, of all kinds of expertise. And as this is becoming much more broad through all the organizations and all the skills that we are going to need to deliver this, I think there's sort of, there's that wastewater engineer, for example, who needs to figure out what is the climate component and the carbon component of what I do. And the same for, structural engineering or, biotech. I think that there is, that additional expansion of capacities in people's core areas of expertise as well. to help expand the delivery of this.
I would add to that too. Should there be more emphasis on education programs relating then to the environmental sector? I mean, there's clearly going to be an increasing demand across, not just in civil engineers, but all across the board. Do we have enough programs in place? Should we be, working, Tej, with the universities, trying to cultivate more programs? I think we mentioned. I'd love to get your thoughts.
Yeah, so my thought on that is probably going to be a bit, I don't know if controversial is the right word or not, but I think, I love engineers. I love working with them, but the engineering community and scientific community in some ways is remarkably conservative. It likes its lanes and it likes to stay in its lanes. I think what we need in this industry is a bit of courage to change and to do things that are different and to employ skills that we already have and are really good at in a different way. And that's actually that's a harder lift than it seems, even though the business opportunity for people who work in that area is very clear. Obviously, things are changing. There's no turning back on what's happening right now around energy transition and decarbonization. It is going to happen. Some people can see that and will jump headfirst into it, but there's a big part of our business that doesn't necessarily do that. And I think we need to encourage some bravery and some courage in this area. That's the way I see it.
If I can,
I'll just echo. Oh, sorry, Rick.
Go ahead.
I just okay. The engineers, the technicians, all very, very important. But what we're seeing also is just this massive shortage in the analysts and assurance, finance, compliance, the risk managers. I'm seeing poaches happen right, left, and center. Recruitment firms are coming to me, not necessarily for me, but for just the Rolodex and help. And this is global, right? This is not just a Canada situation. Globally, there is a shortage, right? And I think with the pandemic, you have now at least more benefit for flexibility for a lot of, employees who have a bit of experience under their belts, and they're being sought after, and they're able to maybe not physically go to certain, regions of the world, but they can do it virtually, right? And so I'm not going to say it's an environmental, expert brain drain that's occurring in Canada, but I think we all have to be prepared that could happen in the near term. And so it's really critical to have the new skilled next gen army of environmental professionals and experts. And there will have to be targeted work with existing academic institutions to develop that curricula. I think there's going to have to be continued professional education type courses specific, and kind of like what Mel was talking about. And I think that it has to happen the sooner, the better, because this demand, it's not going to go away. And as just quickly Tej said, we're already sitting on a gold mine of experience and education already out there in Canada. So to really lean into that and leverage it over the coming years, I think will be absolutely critical.
Excellent. Go ahead, Rick.
If I can broaden this question of education a little bit, and just sort of relate it to what we do at our institute. I wonder whether other people on the panel have had this experience. Whenever I'm out and about at a dinner party, or when such things were possible, or even at the barber shop, or with other people, whenever people find out that I work on climate change for a living, pretty much the first question I always get is some variation of, is it true that we're all screwed? What can we do about it? There's just an enormous amount of anxiety out there with respect to climate change and what the solutions are. And so I think we not only need to prioritize a kind of rethink of how we conduct education in the climate space, but we need to infuse into it the notion that solutions are possible. In fact, solutions are already occurring, that yes, we can figure this out. Yes, we need to do more, but that there's a trajectory to this thing that we can get on top of. And I was really struck. There was a recent massive global poll that was done of attitudes of young people in multiple countries with respect to climate change. And 60% of global youth say they worry about, they're very worried about climate change. And half of the respondents said that it has that anxiety has a negative impact on their daily lives. So, as professionals and as opinion leaders in this space, I think it's really important for us not just to highlight the importance of doing something and highlight the fact that we're behind the 8 ball, but highlight the fact that solutions are possible, and this is what they look like.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to go back to our question box here. All right, companies talk about net zero and are reliant on offsets. What volume of carbon offsets are expected to be available by 2030, and what percentage of emissions will be possible to offset? Is there anyone who'd like to jump in on that one first?
Well,
it looks like Katie's gonna.
Kind of our jam. I think this is where Article 6 was so important. And when I talk about there's a lot of private capital like that's out there, and it was waiting on the sidelines really until we got some clarity on Article 6. I should be very clear though that although now we have an integrity framework and some guidance related to international markets and credits and trading, there's still a ton of work to be done around the actual modalities and procedures, governance, the setting up, right? Actually understanding some of the interplay with the voluntary carbon markets and these broader compliance markets and international cooperation. For instance, how Quebec and California, they're connected with a cap and trade system. There's these tradable units that are going across the border. How do we do proper accounting for that, right? So the world around just offsets and the voluntary space, I will say that it's important for all your audience to understand the compliance space. Hundreds of billions of dollars, likely north of $1 trillion in the next couple of years, right? The voluntary space, it is surging, but it's still relatively small, right? And these are only offset credits that we're talking about. And so there are many forecasts that I've seen about like the amount of offsets that are going to be around billions of dollars to be used for net zero commitments by 2030 and 2050. It is in the billions. Again, it's a range from 2 billion to 50 billion, depending on who you're looking at and the source. And I'm very happy to follow up with anybody in the text box or in the audience if you want more data and figures. But fact of the matter is that they will play a component to all of our net zero trajectories. What's going to be important is to ensure there's integrity associated with those offsets in terms of the accounting, in terms of actually like legitimacy of the supply side of these reductions associated, that there are actual tons that are reduced or removed or avoided. And there's going to be important temporal considerations as well, right? So that means there's going to be a certain amount of these offset opportunities in the near term that have great co-benefits. They're cheaper. There are opportunities readily available. And I would put, nature-based solutions into that category, including agriculture and forestry. However, down the line, we're going to have to see more and more of other types of, offset opportunities, including the geoengineered space. Not to say there aren't available now, but we're going to have to see more and more towards then it's only those types of opportunities down the line. So lots of different considerations, and I won't take up more time talking about carbon markets, but it's a good question. There's a lot of work. Okay, my final point is there's a lot of activity right now that's being done, including by the Task Force for Scaling the Voluntary Carbon Market, now called the Integrity Council on the Voluntary Carbon Market, and the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative. Two sister organizations working very hard, including over the coming months, on driving guidance around integrity on the market side. Thanks.
Maybe I'll just add to what Katie was saying too, and I think it's another important shift, particularly if we revisit the SBTI conversation we were having earlier, is that they've been very clear in drawing a hard line about offsets, and that they are actually talking about removals. And majority of the focus is also on absolute reductions. And so if you're committing to an SBTI target, for example, you can't get there through offsets. You actually have to fundamentally reduce. And what's interesting about this as well, and I just saw a question by Jeff, and I'm going to connect to it here in a sec, is that I think a lot of the investors and those looking at these companies are looking more for plans on what is your plan to actually reduce your absolute emissions, not what's your plan to offset. And so, Jeff, you put a comment in there saying capital will go where it can make the greatest return at the lowest possible risk. Absolutely agree with that comment. What's interesting now is that climate risk, whether that be the physical risk of climate change or the risk associated with the transition to a low carbon economy, is now a component of that risk question. And so a lot of institutional investors and big global asset managers are now asking of their investee companies, what are you doing about this risk? We want you to disclose about it, including what your baseline emissions are and your plan, because they fundamentally understand that there is an inherent investment risk in those companies associated with the transition to a low carbon economy. And so the concept of risk has also changed and adapted over time. And I think that has, it was Larry Fink from BlackRock in his letter in January 2020 who coined the phrase, climate risk is investment risk. We're certainly seeing that manifest itself in the investment industry for sure. There's a lot of investors who are taking the divestment route. Many are taking the diversifying the portfolio route, which is why there's so much capital available right now for these green projects. What's also very promising to see is that in many cases, there's a lot of engagement going on too. So there's a lot of investors who are looking at maybe some of those harder to abate or heavy fossil fuel industries and engaging with them on this transition risk because they see long-term investment risk to understand how they can better support their companies as well. So you make the comment about the subsidies, and I think it's a super, super valid one, but I think it's important also to remember that a lot of those industries are not purely, their financial, sustainability is not 100% dependent on the subsidies. It's a significant component, but there is a lot of, and continued, I would say, increasing institutional and investment pressure to help reduce on that, which I think will have a huge impact, not just on the regulations of what our government puts upon the fossil fuel industry.
Thank you. All right. Actually, Mel, while I've got you talking, I have kind of a question thinking of for you and Tej. So ESG has become an integrated consideration in high-profile firms. But what about the small to medium corporations and institutions? I know we get a lot of those in our readers for our publications, probably online with us today as well. I mean, there's a lot of focus on the large corporations and what they're doing, but how can we better leverage current Canadian and ally resources to decarbonize and drive cleaner growth? And I'm trying to think of those sort of the smaller and medium-sized organizations. What can they do?
I think there's a huge focus there, and I think to our overarching theme of today, there's an enormous amount of capital available, and I think the key is how do we leverage that capital to support and grow a green economy here in Canada. I think there's an enormous opportunity for Canadian companies to leverage this. I think the small and medium companies, I think there's actually quite a few of them who are adopting ESG net zero targets, and as a result are doing very well to grow their companies on the back of those strategies. I think depending on the journey, fundamentally understanding where you are, what your current status is, being very clear on what your strategy is, communicating that with your stakeholders, internally, externally, your customers, and your investees is fundamental. And being very clear about your visions and your strategies and delivering on them, I think is a huge opportunity. And I think those who do it and do it well will have enormous amounts of opportunity to support the green growth here in our country. Because as we said, the game is on, and who's going to get there first or as quickly as we can will be the question.
Did you want to add, Tej?
Yeah. So, I always ultimately dislike the concept of winners and losers, especially in such an important space. But there's sort of, it is kind of shaking out that way in some ways, right? I think the size of companies is somewhat irrelevant in the discussion because I think there's a lot of people who are really thinking about this. So I think it's corporate will, shareholder pressure, which really dominates. We're a privately held firm. We have a lot of internal employee zeal for doing something in this space, which is why we're doing what we're doing. And I think a lot of other publicly traded small, medium, large companies are sort of feeling that as well. So I think that pressure is just going to continue. And I think the key, though, I love goals. I think everyone needs goals in order to strive towards something, right? I still sort of in my head debate net zero is sort of the right goal or not, because I think there is something beyond that. And we talked about removals, and I think removals are a very important part of this discussion. I think goals are one thing, but having, responsible plans for achieving those goals is really important. And I think we need to help people develop those plans. What does an implementation plan to get to your goal really look like relative to sort of your existing assets and sort of where you're spending your money? I think that's the part that's kind of lacking in the system right now. But I think we need to turn our minds to what that actually looks like.
Thank you. All right, somehow we are down to our last 5 minutes. That time just flew past. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to capture everyone's final thoughts. So what would you praise or propose to change about the future of Canada's decarbonization efforts? And I'll give each of you just a minute or so to give us your final thoughts on that. I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but I'm going to choose you first, Katie.
That's fine. Thank you very much, Connie. Yeah, I knew that hour would go by in a flash. Praise, I got to speak to our jam, certainly all over the world with the carbon pricing piece. There's been a ton of work, and the federal liberal government didn't get things really handed to it on a silver platter when it came into leadership on climate change, and it did have to bend over backwards to be flexible and accommodate some of the existing provincial systems that had already cropped up. And there are a ton of work and a ton of innovation that had occurred across some of the existing provincial programs on pricing. So they have worked their tails off in order to have that pan-Canadian approach to carbon pricing pollution. They now have an updated criteria, though, that will really dictate whether provinces gain for the first time or retain equivalency with this federal carbon pricing system. There's a lot of work that needs to be done very, very soon on that. Post 2022, that's just around the corner. So I think that there's a lot of these other buckets, but certainly for our space, carbon pricing in Canada, the evolution of that, and making sure it works, making sure it's really functional, and it's knit together as best it can be, and not as fragmented, is really important, with a strong, stable price signal on that. And I will say my final point is just the rest of the world, because I'm living it and I'm a conduit for it, is watching Canada for a variety of reasons, including on its carbon pricing landscape and how it's stitching things together, how it fits into its broader net zero goals and targets, and how it cooperates with other jurisdictions and trade partners as it moves forward. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, Tej, up to you next.
Yeah, so I think in terms of praise, I think I'm shamelessly optimistic when it comes to this. I think back to Rick's question when he gets asked, are we screwed in this issue? And I legitimately believe we're not screwed. And I think, Rick, your answer was really great. I think I praise, and I think we need to do more of this, the people who are already pushing on this file substantially and actually making a difference and actually launching initiatives that are on the ground and actually moving. I think sometimes we fail to tell the stories of these people as loudly as we should, because there are leaders and there are champions in this field. I think these panelists are a great example, and I think we need to be telling those stories much more forcibly, because things are happening. I've never actually been more optimistic about what's going on. I know there's incredible challenges, but we have mountains of people who are sort of joining this and making sure that we're actually pushing in a positive direction. And I think we need to have a lot of praise for those people, irrespective of the challenges and irrespective of the fact that not everyone's kind of moving at the same level, either from a governmental standpoint or from a nation standpoint. Yes, that's true. But there's a lot of positive that's going on. And I think that's what we need to, concentrate on praising and telling the story in an appropriate way and with a bit of, pizzazz.
Thank you. All right, Rick, you're up next.
Thanks for organizing this. My last thought is that if we're going to decarbonize our economy, if we're going to get on the road to decarbonization by 2030, we need to double down on safe bets. So my organization did a report last year trying to look at pathways to net zero, and we put regulations and policies and technologies into two buckets. So safe bets, those things that where technologies already exist, they just need to be scaled up. They can get us pretty much to where we need to go by 2030. And then wild cards, so technologies that still need research, that are still speculative, that may become important after 2030, but that don't deserve, frankly, the emphasis that these other safe bets do at the moment. So our country needs to double down over the next 9 years on safe bets, electrification, eliminating known sources of pollution like methane. We know it needs to be done. We have the technologies. We need to get on with it.
Thank you. All right, Mel, bring us home.
Thanks for that, Corinne. And I think, not so much a praise or a criticism comment, but I think maybe something I'd like to see happen, if anything, over the last year, we've talked about it here, how much private capital is out there for this shift. I think I'd like to see our government figure out how to utilize that to support the green economy here, but also to support our federal, municipal, provincial governments and infrastructure. There is the risk of the growing divide here. And I think we talk a lot about a just transition and not leaving anybody behind. And so I think there is a lot of private capital out there, but trying to figure out mechanisms by which we can use that to improve the livelihoods of day-to-day Canadians and not just the companies making solar panels, I think is a key component. And would certainly like to see where and how we can support the government in figuring that piece out.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists. And specifically, I would also like to thank Connie Vitello, who's the editor of Environment Journal, for her efforts in pulling this fantastic discussion together. We wouldn't be able to host important conversations like this without the generous industry support that we get. So thank you. And another big thank you goes out to all of our attendees. Your participation through the chat feature, poll questions, which if you haven't already, please answer the poll questions. And of course, the chat box there. We really, really appreciate your feedback. It makes these events feel so much more intimate than they otherwise would. If you follow Actual Media up at the top of your screen, you'll automatically get a notification for the latest information on upcoming webinars. In May, we'll be talking about contaminated site cleanup, so keep that on your radar. Until then, thank you again, stay safe, and we'll see you next time.